Okay, so thank you, Jay. I mean, a lot said there. I mean, one of the things that stood out for me is where you mentioned about the divide in terms of the e-commerce divide and the fact that we are being pushed behind further and further, and the role of our regulators to ensure that the developed world see that we perhaps not as risky as they tend to think. But one of the things I always say, we can say that, but what have we done to really validate that view, in the sense that you don't take the region as a whole, but you can see perhaps that maybe the risk associated with Trinidad and Tobago may be different from Haiti, may be different from maybe a smaller OECS state. What is our role as Caribbean people in terms of getting that information together to present it? What also stood out for me is the point about the need to collaborate. I mean, reference was made with the issue of Scotiabank, saying, well, okay, the regulator here might say it's fine, but you know what? We could run into problems with our international partners because we are an international bank. And therefore, in the final analysis, we are going to operate at that standard, which is the acceptable standard. What then is our responsibility in our end, and how do we make it happen so that we can demonstrate to them that, in fact, the concerns with respect to fraud, terrorism, etc., is not as real as they imagine it is to be? I mean, your comments there. I mean, beyond the software, beyond the program, how do you really validate and come with the hard facts and track them over a period of time to say, look at what your market, look at the indicators in your market, look at the indicators in our market, and therefore tell me where the level of risk is greater?
Well, I was going to say, after being up there for 15 minutes, I'm almost wanting to give to the microphone right away. I would say the short answer is that we need a regional type regulator, a place, and we need to, and I've spoken to this in a few other forums, we also need to learn how to lobby in North America. As a region, we don't lobby. We don't have anyone in Washington pushing our causes. And what we need to do is that we need to learn that most of these things, most of these businesses in the United States don't just get their way because they want it. They do it because they lobby. And a very, you guys may remember this, when someone made a big thing about how Facebook the other day was somehow stifling conservative documents. So people like promoting things that people should read, and apparently the Republican type documents weren't popping up. And they made a big issue about it. And Mark Zuckerberg called for the Republican leaders and had a meeting with them. And one of the things that they wrote about him afterwards was they said that Mark Zuckerberg is a lobbyist in the making, that he knows how to work Washington. And so these guys, and I say to people all the time, Steve Jobs did it when he was alive, a number of times. These persons, when they can't have their way, in addition to their lobbyists, they're in front of Congress trying to push their causes. Google has spends the most amount of money on lobbyists. So the point I make is that we need to be able to come together as a region, but we also need to learn how to push the buttons of Washington and London to be able to see our causes by learning how to lobby them and how to push their buttons.
Okay, so basically what you're saying, we need to have a regional regulator. I would like to hear the comment perhaps from Kim and the others, because many of you would know the challenge we face with the regional stock exchange that has been in the making for umpteen years. We even have our challenge with the whole single market and movement of people throughout the region. How then, and how feasible it is, and how real can we really expect to have this regional regulator in light of our history as well as some of the other challenges that we face currently?
So I can't speak at all about anything to do with the financial market or the financial regulator whatsoever. My background is engineering, and so I won't step over that. What I would say is that in the case of the telecommunications sector, there is a regional organization. I know this is a mixed audience, ECTEL, and they, though the countries within the ECTEL region have sovereignty, they all, I believe all, Antigua, right? So the subscribing jurisdictions to ECTEL formulate their own legislation in their own countries, but all go back to ECTEL as the common source. It would be, I think, it would be excellent to see that at the Caribbean level, and I'm not confident that that is going to happen anytime real. But I think that the ECTEL model is an excellent one.
Hence,
All right, so as I was there listening to the presentation, ironically, the same question that you posed in terms of regional integration, technological, financial integration within the region was top of mind. And I would say, all right, from a political point of view, there hasn't been much traction, and I guess it's a lot of Barbados' fault right now since we held the chairmanship of CARICOM for the last year thereabouts. And it wasn't very high on the agenda in terms of closing whatever gaps were left with when Antigua took over the year before or whatever. Primarily, CARICOM, and this is just from my research, hasn't made any big strides politically in terms of regional integration over the last 6 or 7 years. So I could expect, and this is just a very wild conjecture, that we have some time before any of these things become of priority. I know at least one of the big players, or one of the more, let's say, active players in the formation of the regional stock exchange, Mr. Mallalieu in Barbados, from our Barbados Stock Exchange, is rather interested in how technologies such as the blockchain, the Bitcoin blockchain, could actually help with junior stock exchanges, and maybe that is a low-hanging fruit from a regional perspective. If we were to use the Jamaican example, the junior stock exchange in Jamaica, not only is it fully subscribed, but a rather heavily traded market in Jamaica, despite the fact that there's a lot of inherent risk with dealing with junior companies. So in that light, I figure if we start looking at low-hanging fruit from a technological perspective, then maybe we could accelerate a lot of CARICOM's goals. I would even share with the audience, for instance, something that might seem like a threat, but if you manage certain threats, it could become very big opportunities. About a couple weeks ago, something called the TATT was released. Yeah, and anybody who's into East Asian religion might think, oh, that sounds like something Buddhist. But it's really just a distributed autonomous organization. What that means, rather simply, is that in this organization, you have no need for executives. So in other words, you're using blockchain technologies to make corporate decisions way faster. Shareholders, in other terms, no longer need a board to vote on decisions. You're running the organization from your phone with thousands of other shareholders that you have no idea who they are, except you trust that they're using the technology and you trust who they are. There are these kind of technologies that are becoming very apparent that could allow the region, if we look at how e-government, for instance, could be done across the region in the near future, these kind of technologies could accelerate the promotion of that kind of thing, the e-government. And I wish I could really articulate it a lot more, but I'm saying that at least in the near future, given how slow regulation and legislative procedures are with catching up to technology, you will find probably, and Shiva probably could even support this, a time in the Caribbean in about 3 years where regulators are only now catching up to problems today, but then you've got robots walking around Trinidad jumping for carnival. Right? Just saying.
okay, comment, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just at lunch break, it's ironic we're talking about that now. Just at lunch break, I was saying to my colleague Abigail that we actually need to change CARICOM from CARICOM to CARIGO because nothing is really happening. And I find it sad because we're missing out on a great opportunity. But one of the reasons I think this is happening is because we are at different levels. We have different financial situation in the Caribbean. We have different educational level, and even basic things like vocational level, where we have CBQ and all the Qs. Some of the Caribbean countries are lagging way behind. And I think one of the places we could start is educating the masses. And the awareness would not just stick with school forum, but a lot of the times we assume that the political leaders or the politicians know about these things and would not tackle them, and they could negotiate and have a great impact into all these things there. So we should not just look at the ruling party, but also the opposition and do more education awareness to these people.
Okay, so basically what you're talking about there, I mean, I'm hearing an integrated approach in addressing the issue. Now let's assume, okay, we cannot have this regional regulator per se, because we recognize it's going to take quite some time. Then my next question would be, at the level of the individual jurisdictions, how then they propose to use this digital data, which will help then for them to understand the risk, albeit at a national level. Even before we look at assessing risk at the regional level, what is really happening? Because again, we're saying we are at a disadvantage because of the perceived risk profile. Who then is looking at the risk? I know there's CARICRIS. I mean, the methodology utilized, perhaps that's an area that we could probably innovate on, you know, in terms of utilizing technology. But what then can we do in the different markets to ensure that we utilize the digital information to assess the risk, and we can do it in a general sense, or we can do it again by industry, by product, by something, but clearly it suggests that we will be moving in the right direction. Where are we now?
I don't know if it's going down the line, but I think if I was happened to be the leader of the country, and that question was posed to me about how we would do it, I would ensure that we were able to collect reliable data. Now, I believe that Turks and Caicos is very bad in this, so what I'm saying is that you guys may take it for granted, but I know that being with the Telecommunications Commission, they would be asking for data from the carriers almost like 18 months later, and they're still not getting reliable data. And your data is always dependent on whether or not you want the regulators to get 100% of what you're doing. You may not even want them to see exactly inside of your business. So I don't know how reliable the data is. But the most important thing is that to get the risk profile, you need reliable data. So I would make sure that there are rules and regulations in place to ensure that the companies who you're supposed to get the data from are providing you timely and regular data. But I would also try to find the thought leaders in the industry and encourage the thought leaders, whether they're in the industries, particularly part of the government departments or with the companies, and get them to start writing and promoting and presenting on the topics. Because that's the only way I think you're going to show up on the radar is when your thought leaders start to go out to forums like this and they start to speak on the topics, and those things start to show up on the radars of the decision makers. But I think because as a small country just like the Turks and Caicos, you're not going to get the United States to do something because you want it. But you may be able to come to a forum like this and start to speak and present at it, and then you find that you have like-minded people around the region, and then you start to attract each other, even if it's not a formal body like CARICOM, but just like-minded people coming together, and then you're able to be able to build on that momentum and see if you can push out that way.
Okay, basically I think from what you're saying there is at least we can have an action item coming out of this event, in that what I'm hearing here, the need for certain parties to come together to collaborate, to discuss, and maybe in an informal way start a discussion towards really treating with these issues at the regional level, so that we strengthen the regional regulatory framework. That is
the nail on the head, yes.
Even if I could add to that, all right, it also comes from having a change of leadership within the regulators as well too. And I'm going to speak very specifically to the Barbadian example, very specifically to that one, where our regulators are afraid to act on new developments unless and I mentioned this yesterday and I have to reiterate this, okay? Unless Canada has formed an opinion on it and gone towards legislative drafting, or secondly, if Trinidad has done it. A very recent example, which has actually stifled innovation in the creative industries back home, is the area of drones, using photography, drones for photography or whatever. Now, Barbados hasn't had any legislation, but rumor has it, and it's only a rumor to me since I haven't confirmed it with anyone locally here, that Trinidad is going towards having legislation treating how drones are to be imported into the country, and then defining how they're to be licensed, how they're to be used, all that stuff. But yet, you would have seen in Barbados, since we have a nice budding creative, music industry, video, all that stuff based on that, a lot of people have not been able to compete and get into the market as a result of the Barbadian government saying no more drones are to be brought into the country. And we are waiting, and they said this very point blankly, until Trinidad has had legislation that deals with it. So the same thing I mentioned to you yesterday in a totally different area has been repeated again. Now, I have had, especially at BIT, I've been at loggerheads with regulators over the need to take action on technology-related things and financial-related areas, and that there's already the tools out there to help them be up to speed. And so the second issue that stifles regional regulators from being at least cohesive on a domestic level and then at the regional level, sub-regional and regional level, is the fact that no one has the capability or the resources to go and do the research that's needed or to handle the data analysis. I don't know any regulators back home that can write a bit of code in C or even VBA and create a simple web crawler that will collect all the information that they need, that they can form an opinion very quickly on matters arising from innovations in the marketplace. You've got several countries across the world that have formed and done legislation based on drones, the states and whatnot, but nobody wants to go through the reams and reams of paper to come up with an opinion that would match. So that's the two issues I can see, primary issues I can see, that we have to deal with at the sub-regional, domestic, and regional levels.
Does that not speak to the issue, and before I open up for the floor, the whole thing about opportunity identification and the need for some player to come in? Because when I said player, for example, the regulator doesn't have to do it alone. But the importance there would be partnership, alliance, companies who can do it, and how then you engage that company so that the information is brought forward. I mean, we live in a world of collaboration and networks. So the question is whether or not the regulator sees the importance of it and therefore take the action to get it done. One of the things you said earlier on is that we need to look at the regulators. And somebody said once, if you're part of the problem, you can't be part of the solution. Is it then we have to look at a new face, a new thinking, a different mindset within that whole regulatory system?
You bring me back to the whole notion of what a shotgun wedding is. And unfortunately, it happened during a time where people were scared to get permission. And still, it was frowned upon, permission from the parents of the bride or whomever. So unfortunately, there could be no shotgun weddings when it comes to dealing with regulators in small, very, very, very open economies where information has to be shared. It is as easy for a regulator to shut down any business in the Caribbean, even Jamaica, as big as it may seem, or even in the Dominican Republic, just by the fact that the countries are small. So it might sound as if I'm just simplifying and glossing over the issue, but the fact remains that if Jeremy Stephen imports a drone, to use this example, and I barely fly it in my backyard, all right, the police will be knocking at my door. So unfortunately, there's not that, you have to involve the regulators, and yes, this is the approach that we took at BIT for years. There's no way that, yes, it's frustrating, but one of the recommendations that we, given our experience, would wish that the regulators would take seriously is they need to come up to speed at least with the information before they actually form opinions.
Perhaps I could say a few words, just a few. I find it unfortunate that the word regulator so often today finds itself in sentences, that portray this animosity, like unfortunately regulators. Unfortunately, we have to go to the regulators. I don't understand it. I simply don't understand it. I don't understand it because clearly the role of a regulator is clear to us. Not so? Is it not that we understand that there is need for some sort of oversight over these things? Is it that we think that regulation is a bad thing? Or is it that we understand that regulation is follows on policy which seeks national interest? Is it not that we also understand that over time, things change, the world changes, and regulation itself changes? And therefore, if all of us have a stake in it, Let's stop all of this nonsense about the regulator bad, right? Let's just try to figure out what the entire ecosystem is as it changes. And as it changes, identify the respective roles of each agent in the ecosystem and say, this is what we bring to the table. You see this regulator? We see that regulator is struggling. Yes, regulator is struggling, figuring out how to deal with issues that arose 6 years ago, still struggling. Okay, so how can we, the innovators, how can we help the regulator? How can we all participate in this ecosystem for shared goals and shared value? I can talk more later if I have an opportunity.
Okay, so clearly there's a role for each player. You know, it's like a relay. And some people feel they run a good first leg. And when they hand the baton, man dropping baton, you losing race. You miss out on a medal. So I think that is one of the things they're probably looking at in terms of recognizing a role for each, but everybody doing the part, almost operating at a similar level. I wouldn't say equal, because you may not have an equal level. And I think that is the balance we have to do. Yes, there's a shared vision, but we're in this together. We recognize the role, but are running fast, and I want you to run almost as fast as. All right, so we now open the floor, open for questions from the floor.
Yes, I would just, let me just identify myself. Most of you would identify me by now, but Sylvester Cadet, ITU. I just want to concur with Dr. Mallalieu as far as the approaches towards the regulator is concerned. I think in this dispensation, one of the more critical issues related to finding problems would be the way in which we go about crystallizing relationships. Mm-hmm. And this is critical at this point in time as we look towards new approaches, new avenues to innovation, as we begin to grapple with a new kind of mindset. The important thing is understanding, one, roles and functions, and then understanding how do we forge relationships. Because I think the various interest groups within the sectors, to a large extent, ought to be the ones coming to the regulators, the policy makers. For indeed, most of the policy makers are busy dealing with other aspects of their constituencies and may miss out on certain issues. The important thing is for the sector players to be able to formulate clear-cut and well-articulated positions that they can bring to the regulators and policy makers. They may not always agree, but at least you already have a starting point, rather than you would sit back and say, these people don't understand what they're doing. Probably they don't, but then the onus really is to come together and help them along the way. And that is not to negate the points that you were making in relation to some of the approaches of the regulator. But that, in other words, what I'm trying to say is succinct to the new paradigm is the development of well-defined relationships. And we have to spearhead that within the sector.
If I could reply, just on a point of clarity, don't let my so-called frustrated voice negate the fact that over 3 years, not only was I the person that forced bit towards guiding the regulators and dealing with the FSC and the central bank when we wanted initially, this is before I joined, to go and do it because there was no legislation defining it. I also helped, along with Gabriel and some key others, putting 600 pages together of legislative points for the same central bank in Barbados and eventually the FSC to use in drafting the new legislation that will define this kind of commerce. It isn't to say, however, and this is where not the animosity but the frustration begins, where regulators in Barbados, again I can't paint all the brush, are afraid to act because of a general fear and an unwillingness to come to the table. So that's been the experience. However, it's not stopped us. It could have stopped us from getting the investment that we needed, however. So what I'm saying is that it is important that during the educational process that was very much posited yesterday around the room, that regulators have to come to the table willing to see the bigger picture. And unfortunately, yes, I'll use that term again. Unfortunately, the bigger picture oftentimes is moving way faster than regulators have proven to act in the past, if you're to go on history alone. As an economist, I love regulation. I love it. Started as a central banker. But you have to be, we on one side, the private sector side, have to be aware and very cognizant, let me say, of the weaknesses on both sides of the argument. We want to move too fast sometimes and we'll crash. And the regulators, because of a lack of resources, if you do all the research in the world, it is a lack of resources. It is minor matter. We'll move a bit too slowly. So that's why we have a 3-year process. We believe anything worth doing is worth doing with the Caribbean regulator over 3 years.
Do you have a time frame?
Yeah, 3 years. 3 years.
Question? Comment, and then we take the question.
Just before your question, I just want to add to that and say that we're agreeing that we're supposed to have regulation, legislation, policies to guide, but we ought to be very careful that we do not over-regulate, because business persons will be moving at the speed of light to go places like Singapore and other places with less lax regulations where they could operate, or the ease of doing business is much quicker than the Caribbean, and we need the investment more than the bigger economies.
Yeah, and if you remember Estonia, when the same thing I was telling you about Estonia yesterday, I do need regulators in the region, and I say this very openly, to read up on this e-residency thing going on with Estonia, because the more entrepreneurs in the Caribbean that become cognizant of what they're doing, you know, tax holidays for $112 in perpetuity, big appeal, bank accounts. So I no longer need to bank in the region. Oh, you're being the risk? Great, I'll just use my Estonian or EU-based credit card and have access to pounds and euros and whatever currencies traded through London, which is the currency capital of the world. These are the impending threats that regulators have to be aware of, and policymakers to throw that into the mix. So yes, there's going to be that fight, but again, that's why I kept saying earlier, the bigger picture is something that I think we as a region, both private sector players and public sector regulators, are a little too slow to act on. So even though BIT is moving fast, we aren't moving fast enough if it is that the primary mission of the Caribbean, yes, is to be competitive, but we all want to survive on US dollars, and that is the biggest threat to the region. The fact that FDI will be going elsewhere if regulators are not aware of that big picture, starting with Estonia. Next up is Georgia. It's these sub-European countries that are doing it as a way to revitalize the economy at any cost. Don't be surprised if England does it too, coming out of this slump that they're in. Just saying.
Well, supposedly when England does it, we would probably follow based on what I've heard. So it may happen.
Yeah.
Hi, Reggie Bourne, Chief Telecom Officer, Barbados. I want to clear the air on the, sorry I had to leave the room, but I want to clear the air here about these drones. And the statement that Barbados is doing on Trinidad before legislation is done. I want us to separate the regulator from the policy.
So it's policy matter said it.
Right? The regulators don't write policy or determine policy.
Fair point.
And the memo that I got from Cabinet does not include Trinidad. So I don't know where you got your memo from.
Not my memo. The Nation newspaper. I will give you the date.
No, but that's all right.
I'll give you the date.
But
When I was published.
you can take it from the horse's mouth.
I'm glad you said so.
Right?
I'm glad you said so. But is the Nation published the last week of April?
I can tell stories that I see in the Nation too, and I know that were not true.
But good. But then you need a retraction because that was.
So you can take it from the horse's mouth.
But I'm glad that we. Good. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well,
Okay, so basically it's regulation and context. If we say we want to be competitive, we need to know what others are doing. And I'm hearing about Estonia and all these places. You probably know because you've done the research, but the question how it becomes a way of getting things done, to know what others are doing, to know what we're up against. Because we cannot be talking about being competitive and not understanding what is happening in other jurisdictions. And the other thing about that I would ask in terms of how then what they're doing and whether or not that raises some concerns with the more developed markets and what they have to adhere to. So is it a question of we can probably make the changes, but something is holding us back, and we probably so risk averse that we don't want to move forward. And as I always say, a regulator is operating in the same environment. So if we're risk averse with business, we'll be risk averse in that regard also, because it is a sub of the wider society. Any other questions from the floor? Going once, twice, 3 times? Okay. If not, I will just have some closing comments from each member of the panel. Where do we go? I mean, I've heard some things in terms of maybe some key players coming together, starting the conversation and taking the region forward. If not towards a regional regulator now, but perhaps sometime in the future, but very importantly to help to assist the individual jurisdictions in striking the balance in terms of the kind of regulation so that you treat with the issue of risk, yes, but you allow business to move forward.
I'm just going to say that we've got very bright people in the Caribbean, and when you say where do we go, I would say don't be shy. And one of the things we are about, we're very shy people, and we don't go out there and do. We may go out there and do the studies, but we don't want to go out there and put ourselves in the line and get up and push the regulator and say we've done this, and we go out and want to make the presentation. We sit in the back and we hope that things happen. But like I said, we have very, very bright people. I've got right next to the left of me an MIT graduate, and so we're world class. And I've been making this speech a number of times. People from the regional world class, we can compete anywhere. We just happen to be a little shy. So go out there and don't be afraid to do the studies, write the papers, do the research, and go out and present your research to them, to the regulator, and pull them along. I think that's the only way it's going to happen. It's time we take our place as a region at the world table of decision makers. And don't be shy about it. Don't be apologetic about it. And if you've done the work, and if there's an area that you like, and that you have an interest in, write papers on it, become the thought leader on it, and then go out there and teach the regulators if you have to, and bring them along.
Thank you.
A couple comments about demand side. I mean, this is kind of going back a bit. I didn't benefit from the 2.5 days of 3 here, so you'd forgive me. A couple comments on the demand side, then a couple comments on the supply side, and then I'll wrap up with a couple recommendations from my point of view, if that's okay. My introduction to mobile money was several years ago, very, very many years ago, not in the digital inclusion universe of my friend here on the right, but in the traditional sense of digital inclusion for fisherfolk. We developed at the University of the West Indies a mobile application for mobile money for fisherfolk, and this was motivated by the need in that sector for a means to protect them against several things. One is the risk of threat of theft every time they came on shore and they had lots of cash, but more so the whole issue of money management. And on their way from shore to home, there were lots of intervening opportunities to spend money. And as a result of that, and because of other issues, they were unable to get loans in banks for the purchase of vessels and insurance and a whole wad of issues. So the digital inclusion issues are alive and kicking in the rail on the street. Yeah. Another demand side comment I would make is this harmonization of licensing regimes that Byron made reference to in the context of financial licenses. We face the same thing in the telecom sector at a regional level. If you know, if you know the story of the CKLN, Caribbean Knowledge Learning Network, that was a tragic story that lasted for over 10 years, and with an unimaginable amount of money lost, primarily due to the lack of harmonization in the licensing regimes for satellite segments and so. So we recognize that there are demand-side issues that motivate the kinds of discussions that we're having today. A few supply-side considerations that come to mind. One is that the realities of these, the regulator occupies the unfortunate position modifying this virtuous cycle of innovation. Yeah, the performance, whatever the performance is, in our context, we speak of broadband performance. You know, that following on that is innovation, following on that is investment, which itself feeds back and strengthens the broadband performance, which strengthens the motivation for innovation, etc., etc. We, as a regulator, I speak from a few hats. One is TATT and another is University of the West Indies, but we are in the unfortunate position of modifying that cycle, that virtuous cycle. And I just want to put it to you that there is a reason that the regulator is there. And the regulator ultimately wants, I would imagine, certainly me for myself, I speak, the regulator wants to regulate him or herself out of business. Ideally, the regulator doesn't want to be there. Yes? So ideally, we regulate with the lightest touch deemed necessary to achieve policy objectives. Yes? Nigel spoke today. He was a little hesitant about the term light touch regulation, so he several times said he prefers to go the route of enlightened regulation. But I do want us to recognize that we all have a stake in regulation. We all buy into regulation, and it is our collective responsibility to get it right. Yes? Okay, another supply side issue. The innovation culture is alive and kicking. Byron spoke a lot about it. He would recall, I am sure, several years ago when I invited him to speak to our own new developers in Trinidad. I will tell you a very quick story, and I will say it very hastily because I only have a few minutes. Yeah. Several years ago, when I first started at the University of the West Indies, it was a long time ago, we did not have a culture of innovation, we did not have a culture of entrepreneurship, and we were very satisfied in the industry, the technical industries, engineering, industrial parks, and so we were quite satisfied to import all of our quality professional labor. Yeah, we sought out several years ago to change that culture, and I remember when we started this whole movement of hackathons and development competitions, and so I remember a colleague, a revered colleague of mine, Professor Sinclair King, looking at me and saying, you know, what is the use of this? You know, what then? You know, a student is going to take part in this competition, and what then? They can't build a business, so what is the use of this? And I tried in a very humble way, but tentative way, because it was a very long time ago, and it was not yet proven. I explained to him that my vision for it was that little by little we would change the culture so that you could see in the next generation that we had amongst us a generation of youth for whom it was natural. Innovation, entrepreneurship, natural. They don't have to think of it as something foreign. But they themselves are immersed and brought up in this, nurtured in an environment where they know that innovation is a thing like every other thing. And I would say with certainty that we have achieved that. And we have achieved it through a long road, not a quick fix. A road in which they didn't even know it was happening to them. They didn't know we were doing it to them. They just went and they just found that not only did they now have this culture of innovation and entrepreneurship, but they also developed, and I am speaking for my department, electrical and computer engineering, they have a moral constitution now and a social moral constitution that they lacked 30 years ago. And I am proud of this. But it has come from a deliberate design to introduce this intervention that we recognize was for the long haul, not a quick fix. Right. The other thing about the supply side.
Just briefly.
Yes, you want me to
Yeah.
stop? You want me to
Oh, just about 30 seconds again.
Oh, 30 seconds. Oh, that's
Yes.
interesting. Okay. Right. So I'll forget about all of those things. Maybe I'll just do my recommendations very quickly then. Recommendation 1 is to articulate the motive. If it is that we're talking here, I say, let's first articulate our motive. So my motive really would ultimately be social and economic development for our countries and the region at large. That's it. So everything goes back to that, derives from that. And if it doesn't, then I'm in a different conversation. Second, I would say recognize the ecosystem and represent the roles, responsibilities, and obligations of each person in the ecosystem. Third, I would say establish some fundamental principles. I would say, for starters, rigor. So yes, data, rigor, unbiasedness, and agility. These 3 fundamental principles about any intervention, any program, any activity, any outcome, any output. Rigor, unbiased, and agile. I'm on to 4 very quickly. Pipelining, right? So pipelining is a key thing. Pipelining is about, we need this thing now, but we can't accomplish it with rigor or any of those quality indicators by starting it now. So we vision it years ago, and we start in the pipeline all of the preamble work that needs to be done to get us to make a decision today. And if you don't build that into your organizational ethos and processes, you will forever be doing this quick fix thing that simply doesn't work and is crippling. Moving right along, recognition of the virtuous circle of innovation. Okay, I think you really have to understand the virtuous cycle of innovation, performance, innovation, investment, and recognize therein the dilemmas. This cannot sit on its own. It doesn't live in a vacuum. It is accountable to social developmental objectives that are articulated at the country and region level. It doesn't exist only for the private sector.
Good.
Regulators must realize.
She's giving me a very long 30 seconds.
I know, but you will stop me. When you do, I will stop. Regulators, but I'm coming to the clincher, you see. So I'm hoping that you give me another 30 seconds. Regulators have to recognize a number of things today. We started a number of years ago. Reggie, all the gray-haired people, all of us, we started years ago. We started at a time when this sector, and I talk about telecommunications sector, was not liberalized. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine that? Before power windows and microwaves, a long time ago. And what we did was we changed that. We said this, despite all of the compelling reasons and the legal reasons to leave it as is, we changed it. And I am putting it to the regulators now, that where we stand today is not very different from where we stood then. That we need to have deliberate, considerable, substantial, transformative changes in our regulatory approaches and processes, just as much as we had to change over 10 years ago.
I think I'll have to
At the
stop you
same
there.
time,
I have to, one member of the panel has a flight to catch, so I don't want him to be late. So I know, Kim, you have lots to say, and
Well,
it's
the
a pity.
last one really is to place the responsibility on the innovators. And I know I'm being extremely rude, but this is the important thing. And this is what I'm here to say, is that the innovators cannot sit down and complain about the regulators. Go to work in the Latin America.
Okay, we now on to an innovator, and I'll ask the innovator to respond, particularly since he's the one that has to catch the flight. So, innovator, your turn.
Right, no, I actually do respect the outline, or rather the plan of action that was given there just now. Not only because we are colleagues and she doesn't even know it in terms of my UE hat. And it's the kind of thing, in terms of their experience at UE, that we've been looking at rather recently in Barbados in terms of hackathons, and we're finding a lot more spin-outs and innovation happening outside of the UE ecosystem as a result. So it has a lot of value. I would say, however, that my role, and I thank the ITU for having me here, in this area. But my role, or rather my goal for coming here was to at least appraise, not surprise, but appraise in terms of information. And I do find a lot of people, a lot of regulators are so deeply engrossed into their work, rightfully so, that ever so often I would prefer that they have a bit more of an open consultation, something like this, that helps with the visioning arm if there be one in the regulator. And the reason is as follows. If you were into tech, like Terry at the back, Mr. Hackshaw at the back, like Shiva, like myself, like some of you are as consumers and probably even producers of the technologies out there, you would have heard or seen last week was it? No, week before, Google had their I/O conference. And that's where they bring out new products, at least that you would see in the last half of the year. Just like with Apple, WWDC, I tend to watch Google I/O. I stop doing whatever I'm doing because what you get to see there is what's going to happen in the world in terms of telecoms, finance, everything over the next 3 to 5 years in terms of implementation. So it helps me to say things that I do say very publicly in Barbados, like case in point. I do wish that you had a video with the robot that taught itself how to move stuff around. It was told to pick up, say, a cup. And there was a bunch of trash around it. So it picked up a cup. It was coded, just like Watson would be coded, to pick up this cup. And over time, as you put more obstacles around the cup, it would move every obstacle, put it down so it doesn't break. It would take up fragile artifacts and put them on side without breaking it. You've got self-learning technology out there. Watson was the first, but then you've got even Facebook's Deep Link that yesterday they released in alpha, on Facebook Messenger, which now goes into the area of privacy. Facebook could read anybody's messages and look at the nuances. So if a Trini says something slightly different to a Beijing to Facebook, it means the same thing now. If you see where I'm coming from, it can actually think and decipher. So regulators, my thought to you as an innovator with the innovator hat on, all right, is that the next couple of years, the pace at which not only you vision, but how you interface with policymakers in redacting and refining legislation has to pick up, because there will be new things coming into your market space that you cannot define. And you don't want to stifle the innovation that you were talking about before, and you want your jobs to be way easier. I joked earlier about the robots jumping for carnival. Hear me when my Beijing talking about jumping, I don't know, chipping, whatever it is. I have no idea how you can say it. But the point would be, how in the near future, how as a regulator, and I will throw this out there to you, do you define a human in the near future when you've got a robot that essentially has what's the word out? Basically change education. There's no need for students to study anymore if they've got access to the APIs for Watson. There's no need. So what does that mean for a regional institution like the UE? I'm saying like these are the kind of questions that big visioning regulators have to begin to ask themselves, because it will cause major disruption within the Caribbean. And I love it. I love it. It's a beautiful future for the non-gray hair folks. And could be even a very beautiful future for the gray hair folks once they keep interfacing and visioning. It's very important going forward.
Okay, that's a measure of innovation. The gray hair folks and the non-gray hair folks. All right, so good point. Nice discussion. And I'll just take the last comment.
Yeah, just quickly, I would like to say a big thank you to the organizers of this workshop. It was second to none. But just quickly, I would like to say, instead of asking how, I have always said technology is very easy. The technology is the easiest part. But we should, in our own, try to examine our own situation. And we've heard it from several presenters throughout the week, and see how we could adopt this technology to suit our condition, instead of just taking it wholesale and making it work for us in the Caribbean. And in addition to that, we also need to do, I think a lot of work needs to be done in our human capacity and competency building. And we in the Caribbean, we have a tendency that we do not like to read, but we should open our mind and do some more reading, because that's the only way we could improve the situation that we're facing as we go along. And I also think that government should establish probably a task force with a roadmap as to where we go from here. Thank you very much.
Okay, I just want to give him 5 seconds.
I had asked for 5 seconds. I wanted you to say that I hope you guys watch the regulator and see that when in doubt, it's easier to ask for forgiveness and to ask for permission. Just take the time that you need and do whatever you want.
Okay, I want to say thanks to each member of the panel. I mean, clearly they could have gone on and on. A very interesting discussion. I think very importantly, what for me stood out is everybody recognized whatever we do, what must be at the forefront is how it's going to place us as a region. Social, economic transformation, paramount in whatever we do. It starts with a vision, but the input into that vision apparently is what we have to look at, because I'm hearing some different views in terms of the vision and what you see as the vision. So in how you define the starting point. But clearly, I think we have some good recommendations, but like many other conferences, my concern would be what happens next. So hopefully we make some traction so that next time around we would have narrowed that gap between the developed and the developing, or I should say the developed and the Caribbean region. So gentlemen and lady, I want to say thanks, and I ask you all to give them a lofty round of applause.